Hey everyone! Today I'm sharing a card using Simon Says Stamps Beautiful Flowers stamp set. And this stamp set comes with a large floral image, which will be the main feature for the card today. Originally, when I got the stamp set, I really didn't know what to do with it since the image is so large. It's a little bit bigger than a normal A2 size card panel, and I don't like the idea of cutting it down, but it's just something that I had to do for this card. I'm putting this floral image into my Misty because I'm going to be heat embossing on vellum today. For the vellum, I'm going to prep it with an anti-static powder tool just so that the embossing powder doesn't get everywhere. The stamp set's pretty detailed and I just want to make sure that there's no excess embossing powder anywhere. Once I coat it with the anti-static powder tool, I'm going to ink up the stamp image with Versamark ink, and I'm going to make sure that I get it fully coated so I get a good impression the first time. I use my Misty just to make sure that if I do miss anything, I can go back and restamp it. But I press pretty hard on the Misty and I run my hand all over it just to make sure I get a good impression. I'm going to use white embossing powder for the image today, just so it pops off of the card. I'm slowly adding the embossing powder and making sure that I flick off any excess. Since this is super detailed, I used a fine embossing powder and it worked out really well. And there was some embossing powder at the bottom of the vellum, but I just used a brush to flick off any excess. For heat embossing on vellum, you have to be pretty careful since the vellum will warp pretty easily. So I'm moving the heat tool around a lot, and this takes a little bit more time because I'm being super careful. I just don't want it to warp or burn in any place. But once I finish heat embossing it, it looks really pretty. And off camera, I actually trim it down with a small outline of vellum around the flower. So this part's ready to go and I want to work on my background. I decided for today's background, I'm going to use alcohol inks. And I don't use alcohol inks too frequently only because it's really hard to control how they end up. Alcohol ink kind of moves however it wants and wherever it wants. For today's card, I wanted to do a rainbow image, so I'm just adding the rainbow colors to the background, adding a little gold mixative, and blending it with the blending solution. I'll use a straw just to move some of the color around until I get it to where I want it to look. And of course, it won't be exactly perfect, but with alcohol inks, it's kind of a surprise what you end up getting. And I'll add additional ink to places where I just think that more color is needed. A majority of the background will be covered up with the vellum flower anyway, so it doesn't really matter too much. So I think I add additional ink here and there, but not too much. It does take a bit of time to dry if you put too much on there. I didn't really like the bottom of the background, but since it's covered up, it actually turned out pretty well. So I decided to trim this down to an A2 card panel. Originally, it was going to be a full 5.5 by 4.25 piece of paper, but I decided that I wanted a black trim around it for a black card base. So I ended up trimming it down just a little bit more. And I'm pretty careful with trimming this down because I wanted to keep the red and purple colors on the background as well. Once I have the card base, I decided that I wanted to trim it down just a little bit more and being careful that I keep some red and purple there. And the vellum flowers will go directly on top. To finish the card off, I'll just need a sentiment, so I'm pulling out the Love and Hugs sentiment from this stamp set. I decided that I'll be heat embossing it on black cardstock as well, using white embossing powder, and I think it pulls the whole card together with the black trim from the card base, around the alcohol panel and then the black sentiment. I think it looks really cool. So I'm prepping that black cardstock with anti-static powder tool again, adding Versamark ink to the sentiment and stamping it onto the black cardstock. I'm using white embossing powder and heat setting it with a heat tool again. Once I have that sentiment, I'm just going to trim it down to a small rectangle. Using a paper trimmer is the easiest way. I could use a pair of scissors, but paper trimmer just is a lot faster for me. So I have all the pieces for my card today, and I decide that I'm going to use my ATG gun to add adhesive to the alcohol background, and I'm going to adhere it to the black card base. I always like to put everything together before I tape things down just to make sure that everything looks good. Once I add that alcohol ink panel to the card base, I will use Tombow Mono Multi Glue to the back of that vellum flower image. I'm putting the glue where the heat embossing is just so it hides the glue. And I'm putting a very thin layer and you won't really see it at all. I will go back to add additional glue to the edges that I might have missed, but more or less this is glued down. For the sentiment itself, I'm adding a little piece of score tape to the back and adding it directly on top of the flower vellum. Like I said, I'm just going to go back and add a little bit more glue on the edges anywhere that's sticking up. And it's a very thin layer so you can barely see it through the vellum. So once this card is done, you'll notice that this flower image is larger than the card itself, so I want to trim down any excess. I really wish I didn't have to, but it wouldn't fit in the normal envelope, so just trim it down and it looks fine. So that's it for today's card. I really liked how it turned out. Alcohol inks aren't my favorite because I can't control it, but you know what? It looks pretty anyway. So I hope you enjoyed today's card, and I'll see you guys next time for another video. Bye!